description. It's very important for me, for anybody who's going to listen to this, to please read the description first. Okay, so let me start. Despite the freezing December chill, 24-year-old Rebecca Costa wore only a black tank top underneath her black puffy jacket on the evening of December 3rd, 2009. She wanted to look sexy that night, and she did not have to work hard at it. Her petite frame, dark skin, and long black hair, curly hair, gave her an exotic look that attracted plenty of young men. She slipped her fur-topped boots over her tight light blue jeans, and she sent a text message to her mother before she headed out to meet with her friends. Rebecca's mother, Barbara Ross, she was working the graveyard shift as a nurse at a nearby hospital that night. She made her daughter promise her that she would message her when she got back home safe and sound, just as she always had. It was a Wednesday night in Medford, New York on Long Island. Like her mother, Rebecca was in the healthcare industry. Rebecca worked as a home health aide for the elderly and autistic children, and even though she had to be at work the next morning at 6 a.m., she was out to have a good time regardless. Rebecca and her boyfriend, Dan Mayer, they drove to Holbrook, where they met with her friend Nicole Longo and another female friend for drinks. As the night progressed, the four of them moved on to a different bar called the Butcher Boys Bar and Grill. Rebecca had only been dating 28-year-old Dan Mayer for 2 months. Dan was mesmerized by her dark brown eyes and infectious smile. He was in love. Rebecca, on the other hand, felt that the relationship was much more casual. To her, Dan was just a nice guy to hang out with, and they got along just fine. But as a long-term relationship, she just wasn't too sure yet. She was young, beautiful, and had a promising career, and men fawned over her. She had no intention of settling down anytime soon. Rebecca and her friends drank, chatted, and mingled with the local crowd, while Dan played pool and spoke with other friends in the bar. On several occasions, Rebecca had to chase away men who offered to buy her drinks. Her beauty stood out in a crowd, so she was used to the constant attention. However, she was a bit shocked when one man, a little more aggressive than the rest, took her cell phone from her hand after she shot him down. And he entered his phone number into her phone and handed it back to her. Rebecca just rolled her eyes as he walked away. By midnight, Nicole was ready to go home for the night. She had to work in the morning, and so did Rebecca. But Rebecca was having too much fun. If she went home now, she would still only get a few hours of sleep, so why even bother was her thought process. Nicole had planned on giving Rebecca a ride home that night, but they had agreed that Dan could just give her a ride home later on instead. It was 3:30 in the morning before Dan and 2 friends dropped Rebecca off at her home. Immediately after getting home, she messaged her mother to let her know that she was home safe, just as she had promised that she would. The next morning, when Barbara, Rebecca's Rebecca's mother gets home from her shift at the hospital, she checks Rebecca's bedroom and sees that she's not there. But she thinks, oh good, she made it to work on time. But when her work called to find out where she was, Barbara's first instinct was anger. She assumed that Rebecca had stayed home that night with Dan and slept in. I'm sorry, not stayed home, stayed at Dan's and slept in, and that she had blown off work. So Barbara calls Dan's phone and there's no answer. So she was pretty confused. Dan claimed that she wasn't with him, so Barbara checks the garage and finds Rebecca's car in it. In her bedroom, her purse was laying on the dresser with her driver's license inside. Besides Rebecca herself, the only thing missing was her cell phone. Barbara frantically called and texted her daughter's cell phone, but there was still no answer. She called Nicole and the other friends she had been out with that night, but nobody knew where she was. Barbara knew that Rebecca had made it home that night because she had texted and her purse was there. But sometime after 3:30 in the morning, she had simply vanished. Barbara and her husband, Larry Ross, immediately contacted the police to report their daughter missing. But Rebecca was 24. Although she lived with her parents, she was an adult and was allowed to come and go as she pleased. The police said they would work on the case, but suggested the family give her some more time. She was probably fine and would come home on her own. Rebecca's family and friends were in no mood to wait. She was a responsible girl, and there was no way she was fine if she had not contacted them. Something was undeniably wrong, and they were all panic-stricken. Their home became a makeshift command center. Rebecca's friends and family gathered at the house, printed flyers, and went door to door in the area hoping for any clue at all. Rebecca and her family each had a smartphone app installed that tracked their location. Each time the app showed that her phone hit a cell phone tower, they could tell the approximate area of the phone. In 2009, the technology did not give pinpoint accuracy, but it gave them at least some idea of where her phone was. Each time there was a new ping from a cell tower, several members of her friends and family alerted the police and went to search the area. They knocked on doors and talked to anyone they could, but there was just no sign of her. Her family and friends could not help but wonder if Dan Mayer had something to do with Rebecca's disappearance. After all, he was the last one to see her, and none of them really knew him very well. They had only been dating for 2 months. He could have easily come back to the house after she had messaged her mother. Perhaps he was jealous of all the attention that Rebecca was getting at the bar that night. Some of the family members were becoming convinced that he was keeping her somewhere against her will. After 3 days, Rebecca's family was losing hope when suddenly Barbara's cell phone rang. At last, it was a text message from Rebecca. However, any sign of hopefulness quickly turned to terror when she read the message. Dan has me tied up in the basement. I think I'm in Comac. Barbara immediately tried to call her, but there was no answer. Then she messaged her back. If you're able to message me, just call 911. Panicked, they notified the police and the entire group of family and friends grim looks on their faces. There was no sign of Rebecca. What's more, after questioning Dan, detectives did not believe he was involved. He freely opened his house for them to search and was just as upset as Rebecca's family and friends. But some of the family members were still convinced that Dan was somehow involved. When the texts had come in, Rebecca's cell phone had pinged from Comac, 20 miles from their home. But when family members rushed over there, they found an industrial area strewn with warehouses and no sign of Rebecca. Then, just 3 hours after the first message, Barbara gets another one saying, "Don't tell Dan about my text messages, or he will kill me." Again, Barbara messaged back, telling her to call 911, but she was beginning to realize that the messages were not coming from Rebecca at all. The messages didn't sound like her. They didn't seem as though they were written by someone who was in a panic. And if she could take the time to send a text message, why wouldn't she just have called 911? Barbara was beginning to realize it was all a cruel hoax. 6 days had passed since anyone had seen Rebecca. For a moment there was a glimmer of hope, but it was now clear that the text messages had not come from Rebecca at all. Someone had her phone and was toying with the family, putting them through unnecessary agony. The agony was amplified with dread when police arrived at the family home asking for DNA and hair samples from Rebecca's hairbrush and toothbrush. The truth was, Rebecca had died before they even knew she was missing. One day after Rebecca had gone missing, a brush fire was reported on the side of a road in North Sonnington, Connecticut, more than 90 miles from where Rebecca was last seen. When the fire department arrived, they realized that it wasn't a brush fire at all. It was a burning body. For the next 5 days, the body had been listed as a Jane Doe. Her body had been wrapped in a blanket. A plastic bag was over her head and sealed at the neck with duct tape. She had been dumped on the side of the road, doused in a flammable liquid, and set on fire. When medical examiners assessed what was left of the body, they found that all fingers and toes had been cut off, and her face had been mutilated. Someone had cut off her ears and nose in an attempt to hide piercings. Large areas of skin on her back and one ankle were also cut away to remove tattoos. The missing pieces were not found at the scene. She had been stabbed in the liver and her throat had been cut, which were the wounds that eventually killed her. It took 5 days to identify the body of Rebecca Coster. 5 days of hell that the family had been put through. The hoax text messages that Rebecca's mother had received were sent 2 days after her death. Rebecca Coster's family and friends were beyond shocked by the news of her death. They had held out hope that she would miraculously return, but it wasn't to be. Not only had she died a horrible death, but the killer was still out there and had been playing a cruel, unnecessary joke on all of them. Most of them believed that horrible person was Dan Mayer. Investigators, however, they were still collecting evidence and had their doubts that Dan had anything to do with the murder. If Dan was the killer, why would he have implicated himself in the text messages? It just didn't make sense. Investigators sifted through hours of video footage from Butcher Boy's bar and grill surveillance footage. On the night Rebecca went missing, many men were seen approaching her and speaking briefly to her, but the one who grabbed her phone stood out. He was aggressive, and Rebecca seemed annoyed at the altercation. The video footage, however, was not enough to identify who he actually was. All they could tell was that he was a large African-American male. Detectives pulled Rebecca's cell phone records and found that just after she arrived home at 3:30 that morning, she received a phone call from a phone number with a Boston prefix. She didn't answer the first time it rang, but when the person called back at 4:15 a.m., she answered and spoke to the person for 20 minutes. The clue, however, was a dead end. The phone was a prepaid burner phone, and there was no record of who had purchased it. Oh my god, my dog is snoring, I'm sorry. Police believed the call was from the mysterious man that had grabbed Rebecca's phone at the bar on the night she went missing. He had likely texted himself from her phone so he could get her phone number. Rebecca's friends, however, had no idea who the man was. They had never seen him before. One piece of evidence from the crime scene, however, proved to be useful. The duct tape that held the plastic bag around her head. Investigators were able to pull a fingerprint from the duct tape. It belonged to 30-year-old Evans Ganthier from Central Islip, just 7 miles from the Butcher Boys Bar and Grill. Evans was an unemployed graduate of Dowling College, where he had received a bachelor's degree in psychology. Although he had no prior police record, a New York State business registration under the name Secret Adult Entertainment Services suggested he may have been involved in some sort of escort agency. Perhaps he was trying to recruit Rebecca. Evans matched the video footage from the bar surveillance video. Another security video from the early morning ferry from Long Island to Connecticut showed Evans in his mother's SUV on the morning of December 4th. It turned out Rebecca's dismembered body had been in the back of the SUV as he took that ferry to Connecticut. When the body had been found later that day, Evans had been checked into a hotel just around the corner. When Evans was arrested on February 8th, 2010, he freely admitted that he put his phone number into Rebecca's cell phone that night and that he had called her at 4:15 a.m. It's unknown how he lured her out of the house, but Evans claimed that Rebecca got into his car willingly. As they drove, he claimed that Rebecca began gagging and foaming at the mouth. Not knowing what to do, he told detectives that he took her to his house rather than taking her to hospital. Evans explained that he opened the garage door of his house and had planned to enter the house through the garage, but Rebecca tripped over barbells on the floor and had hit her head on the floor. Evans claimed that she was bleeding profusely from the head, and he put her back into his car to take her to hospital, but she died on the way. The autopsy, however, showed that he was lying. Rebecca had died from knife wounds to her neck and liver. There had been no sign of blunt force trauma to her head. When detectives asked mistake. I can't take it back. Evans claimed her death was an accident and he only cut her up to hide her identity. He admitted that he then put her in the back of his mother's SUV and took a ferry to Connecticut, dumped her body, and set it on fire. Evans had no excuse for why he had taunted the family by texting them after her death. Detectives believed it was a feeble attempt to throw off the investigation, with no consideration of the family's emotions. 4.5 years after her death, Rebecca Coster's killer, Evans Ganthier, was tried and convicted of second-degree murder. He received the maximum penalty of 25 years to life in prison. Rebecca's family will be waiting to protest when Evans is up for parole in 2023.
You know what? I just realized that I forgot to put a break in between the stories so that you know which one is which. So I'm doing it right now. So this is Nathan Richardson and Shannon Rogers, and this bitch is batshit crazy. Listen to this.
Nathan Richardson was working for the Department of Defense in Kuwait in 2009 when he caught a glimpse of a photo of a beautiful red-haired woman on a friend's computer. The 28-year-old Army veteran, he was pretty intrigued by this raven-haired beauty. His friend explained that the woman was a relative of his named Shannon Rogers and confirmed that she was single. He was only too happy to set up an email introduction between the two, and Nathan and Shannon soon began a long-distance correspondence. As they got to know each other better, Nathan learned that Shannon was a divorced mother of 5 boys who was twice divorced. She had grown up in the suburbs of Atlanta and considered herself to be a Georgia peach. She also revealed that she was an actress and that she had performed bit parts in the television shows The Walking Dead, Drop Dead Divas, and Vampire Diaries. Shannon's life was very different from Nathan's, who had joined the Army after high school, never been married, and had no children. But he was not turned off by the fact that Shannon had children. After 10 years of traveling with the Army and the Department of Defense, Nathan was at a point in his life where he was ready to settle down and start a family. After months of online correspondence, Nathan finally goes back to Texas, and the two made plans to meet in person for the first time. They agreed to meet at a restaurant that was located halfway between Shannon's home in Georgia and Nathan's home in Texas. Nathan got there first, and he got them a table. He was nervously waiting for Shannon. When she finally showed up, he breathed a sigh of relief because she was exactly who she had said she was, and she was even more stunning in person. The two of them headed off immediately, talking and laughing as if they had known each other their entire lives. Nathan noticed that Shannon was very passionate about her career as an actress and spent a lot of time bragging about the bit parts she had played in several television shows and movies. He found this a little off-putting and arrogant, but he brushed it aside. Other than the occasional arrogant moment, they got along well and seemed to have plenty to talk about. Sparks flew between them and they began dating, meeting in between their 2 states or flying to each other's homes as often as they could. Whenever they were together, they always had a good time and enjoyed each other's company. Nathan was really happy about his luck connecting with such a bright and vibrant woman. Before long, the two decided that it was time for Nathan to meet Shannon's sons. To his joy, he got along well with all of Shannon's children, and they enjoyed spending time together doing family activities. Shannon explained to Nathan that she had gotten a divorce in 2004 from a very abusive and violent man. Nathan vowed to be a good role model for her sons and show them by example how women should be treated. Nathan and Shannon continued their long-distance relationship, with him living in Texas and her living in Georgia for 2 years. By 2011, Nathan felt ready to take the next step and suggested that Shannon and the boys move to Texas to live with him. Shannon eagerly agreed, and they began planning the move. Before the move plans had been finalized, Nathan got a devastating phone call from Shannon telling him that she had just come from the doctor where she had been diagnosed with a brain aneurysm. Nathan immediately traveled to Georgia to be with her. He was relieved to find her in good spirits despite the diagnosis. She explained that she was getting regular headaches, but was experiencing no other symptoms so far. Worried for her health and safety, taking care of the boys alone, Nathan decided to speed up their plans and move Shannon and the boys to Texas right away. Once he had them moved in with him and settled, the young couple decided to make their relationship official and got married on October 8th, 2011 in a small ceremony in their backyard. Nathan was thrilled to be starting his life with the woman he loved, and he was happy to take on the role of father figure to her sons. He looked forward to a lifetime of she and her sons. Nathan and Shannon's marriage got off to a rocky start. Nathan was surprised when, just a week after the wedding, Shannon's personality changed, and she became dominating and overbearing. Shocked and frustrated by the sudden change, Nathan confronted her about the behavior, and she backed off, and things got better for a while. But it wasn't long before Nathan noticed other things about Shannon's personality that he hadn't been aware of before they were married. It seemed like she would always pick a fight with him before company was planned to come over, or before they had plans to go out in public. It felt like she was purposefully trying to pick fights and was constantly verbally abusing him. After only 1 month of marriage, Nathan was at his wit's end and began contemplating divorce. Before he had a chance to consult a divorce attorney, however, Shannon approached him with some shocking news. She had been diagnosed with brain cancer. Nathan was devastated. Despite their issues, he loved Shannon and couldn't bear the thought of her going through something like that alone. He was also concerned for the boys and what Shannon's illness would mean for them. He immediately pushed all thoughts of divorce aside and gave Shannon his full support. They would get through her diagnosis and treatments together. Oddly, Shannon refused to let Nathan go with her to any of her doctor's appointments, and even refused to tell him the doctor's name, but he chalked it up to her wanting her privacy and continued to support her. A few months later, Shannon told Nathan that she was going back to Georgia to receive a special kind of chemotherapy that would help her in her battle with brain cancer. When she returned from the trip, Nathan noticed that her skin was much more pasty and sallow than usual, and she appeared ill. As time went on, Shannon lost 10 to 15 pounds and developed a sickly demeanor. Nathan was beside himself with worry over her condition. He was also distraught over what would happen to the boys in the event of Shannon's passing. Would they be sent to live with their father, who Shannon had described as monstrous and abusive? So Nathan vowed that he would protect them from that fate at all costs. In January 2013, as Nathan was coming to terms with the severity of Shannon's illness, he received a shocking text from Shannon. It was a picture of a sonogram. Shannon was pregnant. Nathan was very emotional over this new revelation. His relationship with Shannon was extremely up and down, and often strained. And on top of that, she was severely ill with brain cancer, and they didn't even know how long she had to live. These were not ideal circumstances into which to bring a child. Shannon assured Nathan that everything would be fine. She was going to travel to Georgia to see a specialist who would make sure that her treatments did not harm the baby and help her get through the pregnancy. Nathan once again asked to go with her to see the doctor, and she refused to allow him to come. He wasn't happy about being cut out of Shannon and the baby's care, but there was nothing he could do about it. Then, a few months later in April, Nathan got yet another shock when he received a phone call from his credit card company telling him that someone had opened cards in his name back in February and racked up over $6,000 in just 2 months. Nathan was horrified and angry. As he investigated the fraudulent charges, he realized that the charges had all been incurred at places that Shannon frequented. He pulled a credit report and discovered that a total of 6 credit cards had been taken out in his name. All of the cards had been maxed out to their limit. Knowing that Shannon was the only person who had access to his personal details, and that the charges were made at places where she regularly shopped, Nathan confronted her about the fraud. She denied the allegations and tried to convince Nathan that her ex-husband was somehow to blame, but he no longer believed anything she said. Nathan had reached his breaking point. The marriage was slowly sucking the life out of him, and cancer or not, he needed to get out. But when he consulted a divorce attorney, he was dealt yet another blow. The attorney informed him that the state of Texas does not allow couples to divorce when the wife is pregnant. Nathan would have to wait until after the baby was born to seek a divorce. Until then, he was trapped in the marriage from hell. Stuck in the marriage until the baby was born, Nathan did his best to coexist with Shannon over the next few months until he could find a way out. He was managing to navigate the situation peacefully until one afternoon on May 31st, 2013, when armed men arrived at Nathan's work and asked to speak with him privately. To Nathan's horror, once he was moved to a private location, he was handcuffed and placed in the back of an unmarked police cruiser. Scared and confused, Nathan sat in the back of the car for 2 hours. He begged officers to tell him what was going on, but they wouldn't. Finally, someone from the FBI approached and asked Nathan for permission to search his car. Still confused about why he was being investigated, but knowing he had nothing to hide, he agreed. As his car was being searched, Nathan was taken to the security office on the Army base where he worked for an interview with FBI agents. He was flabbergasted to find out that he was under investigation for a threat to national security. Nathan still didn't fully understand what was going on, but he knew it was serious. Finally, agents revealed that anti-gun letters laced with the poisonous substance ricin had been mailed to New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg and President Barack Obama, and they had reason to believe that Nathan was the one who had sent them. Nathan was dumbfounded. He didn't even know who Mike Bloomberg was, and he certainly hadn't made any threats against the president. The situation was even worse than anything he could have imagined. Trying to harm the president was a very serious crime, and someone who was going to go to jail for a very long time. Nathan just hoped it would not be him. The FBI grilled him for hours, finally allowing him to leave in the early hours of the next morning. But he couldn't go home. The FBI had his house under quarantine while they investigated the allegations against him. Nathan went to his parents' house, where he spent the next 3 weeks living a nightmare. A local paper had run an article naming him as a person of interest in the ricin case, and now the people of his hometown believed he was a terrorist. 2 FBI agents remained stationed outside his parents' house, making sure he didn't try to make a run for it. Nathan sank into despair. His life was ruined. He had been publicly named as a domestic terrorist suspect, and he was facing the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. To top it off, he found out that it was his own wife, Shannon, who had gone to the FBI and tipped them off about the letters. He had not heard from her since his FBI interrogation. Then, almost a month into his sequester, Nathan's attorney called and told him that Shannon had been arrested and was being charged with sending the ricin letters. She had admitted to ordering the castor beans online, and that she had used them to make the ricin. She also confessed that she was the one who had mailed the letters on May 20th, but claimed that Nathan had forced her to do it. The FBI was not fooled. They had thoroughly investigated the circumstances surrounding the case, and Nathan had airtight alibis for the times when the orders were placed, and searches were made on the home computer for details on how to make ricin. On June 7th, 2013, Shannon was arraigned on charges of possessing and producing a biological toxin. She was ultimately sentenced to 18 years in prison. Nathan struggled to come to terms with what had happened, just who, with the person he had married. While she was actually pregnant, it had become clear that she had never had brain cancer. He began to question everything Shannon had ever told him. He was in for another surprise when he spoke with Shannon's ex-husband, who she had claimed to have been divorced from since 2004. The ex-husband told Nathan that their divorce had actually been finalized just 18 days before she and Nathan had gotten married. Nathan was further horrified to learn that the ex-husband was nothing like the monster Shannon had described, but seemed to be a nice and decent man. Shannon and Nathan's son, a boy named Brody, was born shortly after Shannon's incarceration on July 4th, 2013. Nathan was awarded custody. In March 2015, Shannon sued 2 prison guards, alleging that they had kept her in unsafe and unsanitary conditions and denied her medical care while she was pregnant. On September 25th, 2015, the case was thrown out of federal court and dismissed. Nathan filed for divorce from Shannon in June 2013. He has fully forgiven her for trying to frame him and says that he is enjoying life and is back to his old self and is happier than he has ever been.
This next case is Carrie and Larry Williams, and this is the last case for today.
This is either the second or third story. So we have Larry and Carrie Williams, and Larry and Carrie already had 7 children of their own, but they wanted more. It had become a trend for homeschooling evangelical Christians in the mid-2000s to adopt needy children into their homes, which were already large. The families felt that it was a duty of their faith to rescue children that needed a good home, and then they would homeschool them according to a conservative Christian curriculum. Other families from Larry and Carrie's Bible study group had adopted as many as 8 children, and Carrie and Larry wanted to do the same thing. So Larry worked as a millwright for Boeing, and Carrie stayed home to homeschool their children. Carrie had attended a women's retreat, and it was run by a ministry called Above Rubies. And during the retreat, they all spoke of the trend among the evangelicals to adopt children from Liberia, which is a West African country that was experiencing political instability from all of the civil wars over there. So in 2008, the Williamses, they contact an adoption agency, and it's called the Adoption Advocates International, but I'll be referring to it as AAI. So this AAI is a secular adoption agency, and it's based out of Port Angeles, Washington. It was run by a woman named Marilee Ripley, and Marilee had 20 children. She had 3 biological and 17 adopted. So Marilee tells Carrie that there are 2 orphaned children in Ethiopia that need a home. One of the children was deaf, and since Carrie learned American Sign Language before she got married, she felt that it was a perfect match. So to prepare for the adoption, Larry and Carrie, they take a quick home study course that's provided by the adoption agency, and they fill out the necessary paperwork. The adoption agency missed the fact that Carrie had left out one section of the paperwork. She left it completely blank, and that section was the part about their beliefs on child discipline. So in the months leading up to the adoption, Carrie and Larry see this 1-minute video clip of the kids crying and begging to be adopted. So 7-year-old Emmanuel, he was deaf, and the other child was 11-year-old Hannah, and Hannah was slightly underweight at only 77 pounds. So they had been living in this orphanage in Ethiopia, in the capital city of Ethiopia, and they both had been abandoned at an early age. They were not related. However, they were both pretty excited about the fact that they were going to be living in the United States as sister and brother. They learned that their new home was going to be in this beautiful country countryside of the Pacific Northwest. And so Hannah decided she wanted to read a book based upon where she's going to be living and what she feels like life is going to be. So she starts reading Little House on the Prairie. In the months after Hannah and Emmanuel's arrival in 2008, the Williamses' post-adoption reports came to the adoption agency. The agency would ask for reports on the children throughout their lives. And these reports seemed really normal. And Hannah had, instead of being 77 pounds, she was now 105. So they felt like they were doing well. However, the next year in 2009, the reports suddenly stopped. And although the adoption agreement said that they'd continue to send reports, they really were not under any kind of legal obligation to file those reports. The adoption agency had no way of knowing the atrocities that were going on in this household. So Larry and Carrie, they believed in a strict fundamentalist Christian lifestyle, and they believed in homeschooling their children with almost all television and internet access prohibited. They believed that women should only wear pants. Not wear pants, only wear skirts, no pants, or dresses. And they were never allowed to wear swimsuits and could never vote. The children were hardly ever seen in a public setting, and they only socialized with a select few like-minded families. Larry would regularly preach to the kids in the backyard. Where they lived was a 5-acre rural property. Now, as for disciplining the children, the Williamses adhered to the teachings of this controversial book called To Train Up a Child, written by the authors Michael and Debbie Pearl. And this book taught that the principles or techniques for training an animal and a child were the same. It instructed parents to begin spanking their children within the first few months of their birth to quote-unquote break their will. In this book, the author's argument for beating a child came straight from his interpretation of the Bible, believing that he that spareth his rod spareth his son. He also said a child properly and timely spanked is healed in the soul and restored to wholeness of spirit. A child can be turned back from the road to hell through proper spankings. So that's his little section of the book. So the book went into great detail of specific implements for parents to use, such as a wooden spoon, a spatula, or the most popular weapon was a short length of small plastic plumbing tubing. And this was a particularly well-liked implement because it could be easily curled up and kept on the parent's pockets, or like in a parent's purse, pretty much everywhere they went. So this book also taught parents to withhold food and to put children under a cold outdoor garden hose as punishment. So this book was extremely popular with fundamentalist Christian homeschoolers, and according to the author, it sold almost 700,000 copies in the first 7 years of its publication. The authors also had a ministry called No Greater Joy Ministry, and that generated close to 1.7 million tax-free dollars a year. So for the next 2 years, Hannah's idea of this American dream quickly washes away. Life with these people was nothing like Little House on the Prairie that Hannah had envisioned. Within months of Hannah getting to the United States, she begins menstruating, and this really made Carrie mad. She told members of her knitting group that she wanted to adopt a little girl, not a half-grown woman, and she complained that Hannah was rebellious and said that she would not wish Hannah on anybody. Friends and neighbors of Larry and Carrie, they noticed that Hannah and Emmanuel were often absent from public family outings and from holidays, trips to town, or even church. On the rare occasion that they were brought to church with the family, one parishioner that knew sign language would often try to sign with Emmanuel, but Carrie and Larry did not want him communicating with anyone. And one of them, either Carrie or Larry, would quickly whisk Emmanuel away before he even had a chance to say anything. The neighbors noticed that the 7 children would be seen actively playing together in front of the Williams home, while Hannah and Emmanuel would be left standing alone near the driveway, staring at their feet.
Oh, Ben, come on. Go downstairs. Mommy's...
This is either the second or third story. So we have Larry and Carrie Williams. And Larry and Carrie already had 7 children of their own, but they wanted more. It had become a trend for homeschooling evangelical Christians in the mid-2000s to adopt needy children into their homes, which were already large. The families felt that it was a duty of their faith to rescue children that needed a good home, and then they would homeschool them according to a conservative Christian curriculum. Other families from Larry and Carrie's Bible study group had adopted as many as 8 children, and Carrie and Larry wanted to do the same thing. So Larry worked as a millwright for Boeing, and Carrie stayed home to homeschool their children. Carrie had attended a women's retreat, and it was run by a ministry called Above Rubies. And during the retreat, they all spoke of the trend among the evangelicals to adopt children from Liberia, which is a West African country that was experiencing political instability from all of the civil wars over there. So in 2008, the Williamses, they contact an adoption agency, and it's called the Adoption Advocates International, but I'll be referring to it as AAI. So this AAI is a secular adoption agency, and it's based out of Port Angeles, Washington. It was run by a woman named Marilee She had 3 biological and 17 adopted. So Marilee tells Carrie that there are 2 orphaned children in Ethiopia that need a home. One of the children was deaf, and since Carrie learned American Sign Language before she got married, she felt that it was a perfect match. So to prepare for the adoption, Larry and Carrie, they take a quick home study course that's provided by the adoption agency, and they fill out the necessary paperwork. The adoption agency missed the fact that Carrie had left out one section of the paperwork. She left it completely blank, and that section was the part about their beliefs on child discipline. So in the months leading up to the adoption, Carrie and Larry see this 1-minute video clip of the kids crying and begging to be adopted. So 7-year-old Emmanuel, he was deaf, and the other child was 11-year-old Hannah, and Hannah was slightly underweight at only 77 pounds. So they had been living in this orphanage in Ethiopia, in the capital city of Ethiopia, and they both had been abandoned at an early age. They were not related. However, they were both pretty excited about the fact that they were going to be living in the United States as sister and brother. They learned that their new home was going to be in this beautiful countryside of the Pacific Northwest. And so Hannah decided she wanted to read a book based upon where she's going to be living and what she feels like life is going to be. So she starts reading Little House on the Prairie. In the months after Hannah and Emmanuel's arrival in 2008, the Williamses' post-adoption reports came to the adoption agency. The agency would ask for reports on the children throughout their lives. And these reports seemed really normal. And Hannah had, instead of being 77 pounds, she was now 105. So they felt like they were doing well. However, the next year in 2009, the reports suddenly stopped. And although the adoption agreement said that they'd continue to send reports, they really were not under any kind of legal obligation to file those reports. The adoption agency had no way of knowing the atrocities that were going on in this household. So Larry and Carrie, they believed in a strict fundamentalist Christian lifestyle, and they believed in homeschooling their children with almost all television and internet access prohibited. They believed that women should only wear pants. Not wear pants, only wear skirts, no pants, or dresses. And they were never allowed to wear swimsuits and could never vote. The children were hardly ever seen in a public setting, and they only socialized with a select few like-minded families. Larry would regularly preach to the kids in the backyard. Where they lived was a 5-acre rural property. Now, as for disciplining the children, the Williamses adhered to the teachings of this controversial book called To Train Up a Child, written by the authors Michael and Debbie Pearl. And this book taught that the principles or techniques for training an animal and a child were the same. It instructed parents to begin spanking their children within the first few months of their birth to quote-unquote break their will. In this book, the author's argument for beating a child came straight from his interpretation of the Bible, believing that he that spareth his rod spareth his son. He also said a child properly and timely spanked is healed in the soul and restored to wholeness of spirit. A child can be turned back from the road to hell through proper spankings. So that's his little section of the book. So the book went into great detail of specific implements for parents to use, such as a wooden spoon, a spatula, or the most popular weapon was a short length of small plastic plumbing tubing, and this was a particularly well-liked implement because it could be easily curled up and kept in on the parents' pockets or like in a parent's purse pretty much everywhere they went. So this book also taught parents to withhold food and to put children under a cold outdoor garden hose as punishment. So this book was extremely popular with fundamentalist Christian homeschoolers, and according to the author, it sold almost 700,000 copies in the first 7 years of its publication. The authors also had a ministry called No Greater Joy Ministry, and that generated close to 1.7 million tax-free dollars a year. So for the next 2 years, Hannah's idea of this American dream quickly washes away. Life with these people was nothing like Little House on the Prairie that Hannah had envisioned. Within months of Hannah getting to the United States, she begins menstruating, and this really made Carrie mad. She told members of her knitting group that she wanted to adopt a little girl, not a half-grown woman, and she complained that Hannah was rebellious and said that she would not wish Hannah on anybody. Friends and neighbors of Larry and Carrie, they noticed that Hannah and Emmanuel were often absent from public family outings and from holidays, trips to town, or even church. On the rare occasion that they were brought to church with the family, one parishioner that knew sign language would often try to sign with Emmanuel, but Carrie and Larry did not want him communicating with anyone. And one of them, either Carrie or Larry, would quickly whisk Emmanuel away before he even had a chance to say anything. Now, the neighbors noticed that the 7 children would be seen actively playing together at the front of the Williams' home, but Hannah and Emmanuel, they would be standing there in the driveway alone, just staring at their feet. At home, the discipline was much worse than anyone could have imagined. Hannah, she had hepatitis B, which again made Carrie really, really mad, and she accused Hannah of purposely smearing blood on the bathroom walls. So because of this, Hannah was not allowed to use the bathroom in the house. She was only allowed to use a filthy outdoor portable toilet, which was behind the barn, and that toilet was only serviced twice a year. Also, the indoor shower was off limits as well. This, regardless of temperature, Hannah Hannah's shower was a garden hose propped up with sticks in the front yard. Hannah was often forced to use the cold makeshift shower while the other children watched from the windows of this warm house. When Hannah made any sort of complaint about the clothes that Carrie had chosen for her to wear, she would lose her right to wear clothes at all and was given only a towel to wear for the day. Hannah had long, beautiful braided hair, and she was really, really proud of it. It was the actual one thing that Carrie took pride in, that Hannah took pride in, and Carrie knew it. The first spring of Hannah's new life, she was told to go cut the grass in the backyard, and when she was done, Carrie was super mad because she said that Hannah had cut the grass shorter than she had wanted it. So, as a punishment, Carrie shaves her head. And that was not the first time she would shave her head. She would shave her head on 2 other additional occasions. These daily punishments had begun almost immediately after the children were adopted. Most of the time, Emmanuel and Hannah had no idea why it was they were being punished. It could have been for something like standing in the wrong place or getting an answer wrong on their schoolwork. They just were never quite sure. So a few months after arriving in the United States, traumatized by the change of environment and the daily punishments, Emmanuel starts to wet the bed, and Carrie and Larry were convinced that Emmanuel was doing this on purpose just to make them mad. So Emmanuel was taken outside, and he was given a shower with the cold hose, and then he was sent to sleep in the actual dark shower room. And to add to Emmanuel's trauma, Carrie would often tease Emmanuel by running the plastic tubing. She was calling that plastic tubing a switch, and she would run it up and down his face. On one occasion, Larry had hit Emmanuel on the top of his head with his fist, and which caused Emmanuel to start bleeding with blood running down his face. That night, he was made to sleep outside, and the other children were told not to sign with him at all. These punishments were straight from that book called To Train Up a Child, and it involved beatings with a piece of plastic tubing that Carrie kept in her bra. Sometimes it was one of Larry's belts folded in half, or a long, flexible piece of glue stick. Other common forms of punishment that the Williams used was in denying food, denying clothes, forced outdoor sleeping, and cold outdoor showers. Now, the Williams' biological children were punished as well, but never to the severity of Hannah and Emmanuel. Emmanuel and Hannah, they were fed different meals than the biological children. While the other children had sandwiches, Hannah and Emmanuel, they would have a sandwich as well, but Larry or Carrie would pour a glass of water over the sandwich, and they would sometimes get cold leftovers with unheated frozen vegetables. Almost always, the 2 children were forced to eat outside while the other children ate inside, regardless if it was cold or raining, snowing. It didn't matter. Now, because Hannah was menstruating, Larry and Carrie take these steps to officially change her age. And Carrie told her friends in the knitting group that if they could make Hannah bump her when she turned 18. And when another member of the knitting group asks her, well, if you do that, how is she going to survive in the outside world? And Carrie just told her it would not be my problem. In the 3 years that Hannah lived with the Williamses, she went from sleeping alone in the barn behind the house to being locked inside a bathroom with no lights, to eventually being kept in a 4-foot by 2-foot closet for up to 24 hours at a time. And Larry, he would record Bible sermons and religious music, and he would play it outside of the closet the entire time so that Hannah could not sleep. In the afternoon of Wednesday, May 11th, 2011, Carrie sends Hannah into the backyard as one of her daily punishments. It was raining outside. It was in the spring, and the temperatures were only in the mid-40s. So Hannah, she was only wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and she complained that she was cold. So Carrie commanded that she do jumping jacks in the yard in order to stay warm. And after a few hours alone outside, the children noticed that Hannah's lower lip was quivering. She seemed unable to control her own movements. She had fallen a few times, and eventually she had trouble standing up at all. Carrie went out the back door of the house, and she grabs Hannah by the arm, and she leads her to the outhouse behind the barn. And as she's doing this, Hannah is falling down. She keeps falling down, and this is making Carrie really, really mad. And Carrie believed that Hannah was only trying to create attention. So, unable to get her to stand, Carrie just leaves her lying alone in the yard. Hours go by, and Hannah's clothes were soaked. So Carrie sets dry clothes on the back porch, and she yells at Hannah to come back inside the house. But Hannah doesn't return. So Carrie gets her 2 oldest sons, and she gives them that plastic tubing, and she tells them to hit Hannah for not following orders. So, strangely, as the boys whipped her, Hannah started to remove her own clothing, and when she did that, Carrie called the boys back inside. By 5 p.m., Hannah began throwing herself down on the pavement, and her knees and hands were bloody, and Carrie just sat there watching from inside the house. And when Carrie decided she couldn't watch anymore, she leaves the window and just ignores Hannah for the rest of the evening. Now, near midnight, the 7 biological children were laughing at Hannah. They were looking out the window and just staring at her and laughing. And they noticed that Hannah had removed all of her clothing, and she was still uncontrollably throwing her body around in a fit. She was like wallowing in the mud, and she was pounding her own head into the ground. But these kids, they watched and they were laughing. What they didn't realize is that Hannah was experiencing what's known as paradoxical undressing. In the final stages of hypothermia, the nerves can become damaged, which causes irrational behavior. The final stage of hypothermia tricks the mind into thinking that it's extremely hot, which causes the person to remove their clothes and attempt to burrow themselves into the ground. So when Hannah finally stops moving, one of the daughters calls her mother over to check on Hannah, She was face down in the yard with a mouth full of mud. Carrie, very upset, she's mad because Hannah's nude, and so she grabs a bed sheet and she wraps it around Hannah, and then she tells her boys to drag her into the house. First, Carrie calls Larry. He was driving home from work, and then she calls 911 after that, and she tells the operator that she says, "I think my daughter just killed herself." She said she's really rebellious and she's been outside refusing to come in, and she's been throwing herself all around, and then she collapsed. So the operator asks, "Well, is she breathing?" And Carrie says, "No." And then the operator says, "How old is your daughter?" And she says, "I don't know. We adopted her almost 3 years ago." And Carrie continues to tell the operator she's somewhere between the ages of 14 and 16. She was throwing herself all over the yard. We went to bring her in. My sons tried to carry her in, and she took her clothes off. She's very passive-aggressive. I don't know how to describe it. So during the call, Carrie just sounds more annoyed than upset and sad or shocked even. So the 911 operator coaches Carrie through CPR, but it was no use because Hannah was gone. So when emergency crews arrive, Hannah has this large lump on her forehead and she's covered in blood. Her hips, knees, elbows, and face had fresh blood markings from her repeated whippings, and she also had a stomach infection. Now, the post-mortem examination of Hannah's body showed that she was abnormally thin for just 13 years old. At only 5 feet tall, she was emaciated and she had gone back down to 76 pounds. She was lighter than 97% of girls her age and thinner than she was when she had come from Ethiopia 3 years earlier. The official cause of death was hypothermia compounded by malnutrition and gastritis. It was determined that her body had been too thin to retain enough heat on the day she died. When Child Protective Services knocked on the Williams' door the following day, Larry wouldn't let them in. 2 weeks after Hannah's death, the entire family was interviewed by detectives in Child Protective Services, and all of the children gave the same story, obviously coached by their parents. They were saying that Hannah was rebellious and possessed by demons. When Emmanuel was interviewed, he told detectives that people like Hannah got spankings for lying and go into the fires of hell. When Larry heard Emmanuel give that answer, he immediately stops the interview and takes the kids home. So 2 months go by with no charges brought against them when Child Protective Services receives an anonymous tip. Someone claimed that Carrie did not like her adopted children, and Emmanuel was being treated much like Hannah. So with that news, Child Protective Services worked with detectives and they opened a formal investigation. All 8 of the Williams children were taken into foster care. During a search of the house, police found a copy of the book To Train Up a Child. Even after months in foster care, Emmanuel was afraid of his foster parents, and he nervously would apologize for every little mistake he made, even asking his foster mother why she wasn't beating him. He told his therapist of repeated nightmares and constantly worrying that he's going to be the next to die. Emmanuel was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. That September, more than 4 months after Hannah's death, Carrie and Larry were arrested on charges of homicide by abuse and first-degree manslaughter for the death of Hannah, as well as first-degree assault of a child for the abuse of Emmanuel. Carrie and Larry each faced a potential life sentence. Both posted bail of $150,000 each, but they were given strict orders to not contact each other or any of their children, either directly or through third parties or any other means. However, when Larry continued to send highlighted Bible verses to the children, the prosecution believed them to be coded messages encouraging them to come to his defense. Larry was arrested again, and this time he was placed in a state jail where he remained for almost 2 years waiting for trial. This was not the first time that the book by Michael and Debbie Pearl had been linked to a child's death. 2 other sets of fundamental Christian parents that used these tactics from the book had recently killed their adopted children. They were Sean Paddock and Lydia Schatz. The 3 deaths happened in different parts of the United States, but all were adopted, homeschooled, and beaten with a length of 1/4 inch plastic tubing. 7-year-old Lydia Schatz's parents, Kevin and Elizabeth, they held her down and beat her for 9 hours with a piece of the tubing, this for pronouncing the word pulled incorrectly. 4-year-old Sean Paddock's mother, Lynn Paddock, smothered him in a blanket wrapped too tightly around him because she wanted to stop him from getting out of bed in the middle of the night. Like Hannah, the abuse eventually killed these children, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. At trial, Carrie and Larry turned on one another. They sat at opposite tables in the courtroom, rarely ever looking at one another. Larry testified that the discipline was all at the hands of Carrie, and Carrie testified that her discipline was because Larry was trying to enforce this book and she was just trying to go along with it. But the children testified that lying was considered one of the most serious offenses in their household. How ironic. One of the Williams children, his name was Joshua, he confirms that Hannah had not been homeschooled and she had not eaten meals with the other children for at least 1 year before her death. So Joshua tells the court that Hannah would sometimes go 2 days without anyone speaking to her, and none of the biological children liked her. But he says it didn't matter because she was always in the closet. Emmanuel ends up testifying using sign language with the help of interpreters, and the courtroom was super silent as he was asked what he thought happened to Hannah, and he signs, "I don't know. She disappeared. I think maybe she's dead." He also testified that he was often beaten with a stick or plastic tubing until blood ran down his face. He said, "I would suffer with the pain until eventually it would just go away." The biological children admitted that they were coached to tell authorities that Hannah slept in the bedroom with them, when in fact she slept in a tiny locked closet. The jury was shown the closet that Hannah slept in, and they were shown photos of all of the scarring on Hannah's body. Larry testified that he trusted his wife's discipline choices with the adopted children because she had done such a good job raising the other children. Carrie rebutted that her husband was an equal participant in the discipline and even came up with some methods on his own, such as hosing off Emmanuel and locking him in the shower after he would wet the bed. She also testified that Larry was the one that installed the lock on the closet door. During the trial, the defense attempted to argue that Hannah was actually 16 years old rather than 13. If she had been 16 at the time of her death, the homicide by abuse charge could not be applied because it only applies to children younger than 16. There was no documentation of Hannah's birth, or Emmanuel's for that matter, that proved Hannah's age either way, so the trial was postponed to have Hannah's body exhumed for examination. The tests on her teeth and her bones, however, were inconclusive, and experts could not confirm that she was 16. The defense agreed that Larry and Carrie may have been bad parents and that their choices were bad, but they weren't killers, and they had no idea that their form of discipline would lead to the child's death. After 7 weeks of testimony, the jury does not agree with the defense, and both Larry and Carrie were convicted of first-degree manslaughter and first-degree assault. Carrie was also found guilty of homicide by abuse and was sentenced to 37 years in prison. Larry Williams was sentenced to nearly 28 years, and he was given credit for the almost 2 years that he had been in jail awaiting trial.
So that's it. Those are the 3 stories, and I appreciate you hanging in and listening if you did. I hope you all have a good night. Oh, wait a minute. Some of you weirdos actually like when I do this. Good night.